Thank you. In the spirit of keeping our presentations up to date and incorporating all the world events, and because a question was asked about this morning, we've taken some time at lunch and we've reconfigured our presentation. So today we're going to talk about logistics, infrastructure challenge in Mexico after the Donald Trump wall. I tried that. We can laugh at ourselves. We may as well do it once in a while. Okay, to get into it, I am going to touch on logistics infrastructure, some of the hard points about it, but in reality, there's a lot smarter people than I am to stand up here and tell you how to fix the logistics infrastructure issues in Mexico. But to me, really, the question isn't how to fix the logistics infrastructure. I mean, to us, as a logistics supplier, it's knowing that the barriers that those infrastructure challenges create, what actions do we take to minimize that impact on the automotive supply chain? So that's really the question I'm going to talk about. So the focus of the talk today will be a little more tactical in how you move shipments given these infrastructure challenges, and really what role a logistics supplier can play in identifying these infrastructure challenges and then minimizing their impact on the customers and the supply chains. Just in case anybody was wondering who Hellmann is, I'll just give you a quick 30-second introduction. Hellmann's a family-owned company. It's been started since 1871. It started with a couple horses and a wagon hauling furniture in Germany. Now we have 12,500 people worldwide. We do a full range of freight forwarding services, contract logistics, brokerage, road, and a few other things. Our global annual turnovers projected to be about 3.6 billion euros this year. And we're really centered around 5 industry verticals or industry solutions. The most critical one for us is the automotive vertical. It's the largest. But I think what really differentiates Hellmann is the family DNA. It goes right back to the core of Hellmann and the start of the company. And it really governs how we treat each other inside the company and the relationships we form with our partners outside the company. And the last point is we just celebrated our 15-year anniversary in Mexico. So we have a very strong Mexico team, and in my opinion, clearly one of the strongest teams in our company. So just to jump right in, you can't really have a logistics infrastructure discussion without taking a quick look at the Mexico automotive cluster chart. And every time I look at this, it seems to get busier and busier. But just a few comments. Mexico is ranked number 4 now in finished vehicle production, depending on what survey you look at. It's number 8 if you factor in trucks and component parts. And there's a projection to build 5 million vehicles by the end of 2020. The infrastructure is improving. There's 117 coastal deep water ports, and more material is moving by intermodal. But there are a few hard point challenges. A couple come out in the data. One is that there's a real shortage of finished vehicle terminals in the ports. There's still a shortage of equipment in a few areas, and it's compounded by the fact that southern border crossings are up 26% and 41% in Laredo alone. So, but if you look at the chart, you can see the clusters, the 2 biggest ones. And I know I'm stating a little bit of the obvious here, but we just have to kind of get set before we talk about the challenges. But Toluca and Silao are typically the biggest ones. But if we heard this morning, the fastest growing ones are in central Mexico, and you heard Governor Marquez say that he plans to build 2 million vehicles there in 2 years, so it's just going to get a little more difficult. I promise this will be the last Hellmann slide I put up, but my colleagues would would have given me some business if I didn't show you where our offices are. This, what this really shows is when you look at that automotive cluster chart, we're really aligned with the needs of the marketplace. Our main control tower's in Mexico City here. So really, just to jump right in and talk about the Mexico infrastructure, we looked at, to get some background information, we looked at a couple of different surveys. The one you see here is the World Economic Forum. And basically, we looked at three pillars that we thought were most relevant to this discussion. The first one is transport infrastructure. The second one is transport services. And the third one was import processes. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say Mexico has a horrible infrastructure because the data says the opposite. I mean, if you look at this, many categories show Mexico as a competitive advantage. And the investment's growing, and in many areas, the indicators say the infrastructure is improving. But having said that, if I talked about only the good things, what fun would we have here today? So when you look back at the chart, I mean, it does show that Mexico has some serious competitive disadvantages in four of the major areas: transport infrastructure, rail infrastructure, port infrastructure, and paved roads. Oh, hang on, I went too far. So this one has the transport services. It's a little bit of the same thing. So what this tells me, what I take away from these slides, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. So you've got Mexico where they're excelling in some areas, but there's some critical areas where they're in the bottom third. And that's fine if you're in an economy that's flat or declining, but when you're in an economy that's experiencing double-digit growth or hyper growth, and you're in the bottom third in some of these critical categories, that's when you're going to have some serious supply chain issues. So that's kind of what we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on. So the question is, I mean, if you're a logistics supplier trying to protect your customer in Mexico and you have these infrastructure challenges, what do? I mean, we can't build roads. We can't add customs inspection stations. So I think we turn the conversation to the softer side of a supply chain infrastructure, and that's the people and the impact that the people can have on these supply chain constraints. So, you know, at the end of the day, that's really the way a logistics supplier can create value, by getting a talented team to bear on these issues and close them or at least minimize their impact. So to that effect, a few themes evolved. Out of the data, we pulled some of the ones that we just wanted to kind of do a mini deep dive on. Again, I don't think I'm going to surprise anybody with this, but the five we've got here are, in some areas of Mexico, there's a shortage of qualified labor. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but you use SLP as an example. You've got General Motors and Cummins there, and BMW, and I think Ford have announced they're going to arrive, so that's 4,000 person facilities with the corresponding supplier parks that go around them. So, I mean, you're going to have a real issue bringing the right type of talent. The next one is high logistics cost, and this doesn't mean that boats and airplanes are more expensive in Mexico. I'm talking about waste, and this is the waste created by some of these logistics infrastructure challenges through rework and premium freight. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. The next one is the development of local supply sources. It's getting better, but really what it does is it leads to extended global supply chains. The last two I had here were efficiency and transparency of the border process, and that gets into predictability of border crossings. And then the last one, I'm not going to deep dive it, but I did want to mention it. In these automotive cluster areas, a lot of secondary problems are starting to emerge. local road systems, hotel capacity, and issues with city engineering. And on one of the coffee breaks, I was just talking to a friend of mine, and he said he was traveling in one of the central Mexico states, and a car ran into a truck in front of him. He said he was stuck on the road for 2 hours. He missed all of his sales calls. So could you imagine if you're an automotive company and your parts were in that same traffic jam? Those are some of the things that come up. So we're going to take those first four I talked about and just do a mini deep dive on what role the logistics service provider can play to help minimize those gaps. So really, just to introduce you how this is laid out, we've got the competitive disadvantage on the far right, and then that's a country disadvantage. And then what we did was we said, this is how it affects the supply chain and the gap it creates in the supply chain, and then the role that the logistics supplier can take to address that gap. So the first one we talked about is a shortage of qualified labor, and I want to be clear here that this is a quantity issue and not a quality issue. As I said, there's plenty of great people doing great things here, but in some of these areas where the growth, and you heard it in the governor's speech today, there's just a big push on qualified labor. And I'm not talking about people that can do Excel and PowerPoint. It's a term I like to use. It's called automotive grade talent. And I think most of you in the automotive industry will know what I'm talking about when I say automotive grade talent. I mean people that are trained to solve automotive problems. So people that know customs, they know lean methodology, they know Six Sigma, they know IT, connectivity, whatever it is, because without this, the gaps that are created in the supply chain, or you're trying to manage high-tech extended supply chains without this talent, you're trying to staff and man control towers in every region. These control towers have to do things like ASN, automated reporting. You have to do continuous improvement projects, and you have to do problem solving. And I've got Hanjin here. Has anybody heard the word Hanjin in the last 2 weeks? When that issue broke, Hellmann had almost 4,000 containers on the water. And you can imagine, the inquiries we were getting when you have 4,000 containers in limbo. So we had a lot of problem solving to do the last few weeks over that. But the role that the logistics supplier plays to close that gap, really, I'm kind of going to break this far left column down into two areas. One, it's creating sustainable teams, and I think Hellmann does this really well in Mexico as part of the DNA. We have a lot of very long-standing, tenured people, very low turnover, and what that does is it builds up a technical base. We also try to build those people up. For example, the Mexico team has been to Detroit to see me twice this year. They spent 2 weeks in Europe for training, and we have programs like the Intergrad program where we rotate people from Mexico around the country, and they sit in different places and come back to Mexico so they know what happens on the other side. But one of the stories I like to tell is about our CEO. His name is Piotr Zaleski, and he's a Polish gentleman that was an intern at our headquarters in Germany. He did very well. He secured some business that brought him to Mexico and impressed the bosses in Mexico, so they invited him to come and work here. He went through a series of promotions and became our CEO. So that's just an example of how you can develop people internally to help address these gaps. All right, you're all thinking it, so I'm going to say it. How did we let a Polish guy run Mexico? The other thing here is we can't learn on the job. So really the question there is, how do you come into Mexico and open up a 300-person sequencing center when you've done it all over the rest of the world, but maybe not here? You've got metrics, you've got processes. How do you get people to understand? Well, the way you do that is you have to import your areas of expertise, and you have to reach to your global extended network to do that. But the key is you have to do that in a way that doesn't interfere with the local culture and that melds well. And currently we're addressing that issue in SLP right now. So those are a couple of ways that a service provider can help bridge the shortage of qualified labor. Next one is high logistics costs. So again, really, this isn't about rates. It's not about money going out the door. It's more about eliminating waste created by these supply chain issues. So, the logistics infrastructure challenge it creates is you have an unoptimized network, and maybe you don't have enough available modes. Maybe you're not using the right mode. Also, it takes resources to do the analysis and solve these kinds of problems, and you need data. And by data, I don't mean spreadsheet data. I mean data that tells you a story, data over time, data that has analysis. And one of the best ways that a logistics service provider can help an OEM or a Tier 1 get through this is just by doing, I just want to back up and say, what this does is the gap it creates in the supply chain. The best case is you're going to have a suboptimized network. The worst case is you're going to make the wrong decisions. And you're going to commit time and resources to the wrong issues. And how many people in this room have fixed a problem and thought they had it fixed only to have it come back the next week or the week after that? And why is that? Because we fixed the wrong thing. We fixed what happened last week instead of taking a longer view at it. So root cause analysis is one area where we try to do that. And an example of this, I was down here 2 years ago. I was in an OEM's office, and we had this issue that kept reoccurring, and I'll tell you, he was not happy. And I'm in this room, and I'm watching everybody yell at each other in Spanish. And finally, he looks at me, and he says, Dave, you're as bad as you were 3 years ago. You haven't improved one bit in 3 years. And I walked out, and I asked our team, is that right? Because I couldn't tell. I couldn't answer that question, and nobody could. We had no data to justify that. It's just a perception. So we went back, we measured it, we tracked our failures, we tracked the root cause of those failures, and we put action plans against them. And next time we were in a business review with that customer, it came up again, and I was able to say, stop, wait. Yes, we've had a few failures, but in the last 8 months, I had 8,000 shipments. Of those shipments, I had 37 failures. Of those failures, here's my 5 actions, and here's my action plan against those. And guess what? I never had that discussion again. But what that does is it eliminates the time and the chaos created in solving a problem 4, 5, 6 times. So you have to stop and just analyze the data. Some other areas are continuous improvement programs to eliminate waste, like value stream mapping sessions or workshops. The other thing we can do is we can share best practices from other industries. I mean, we're uniquely qualified to do that to automotive because we see fashion, we see pharmaceutical, we see defense. So if these things apply, we can bring those suggestions up to automotive customers. Probably the last thing here is provide options, and we're always asked that. We're always asked that by our customers is what should I do, and it takes a little creativity. Maybe we have to go to a different port. Maybe we have to go to our off-standard ports, especially in the Hellmann case. But the thing is, you have to look at it, and that's one way you can take cost out of your customer is by giving them some of the scenarios and letting them make good decisions. The next one is the efficiency of the import process. And again, there's a lot of good actions going here. There's a lot of good government programs. The data says this is getting better. But what this gets to is the time predictability of imports and crossings. It leads to the infrastructure challenge is high cost to import, high cost to export. And the gap in the supply chain it creates is plants need to carry additional inventory, additional operational reserve to buffer for this. And if the delay is too long, it could result in premium freight. expedited trucks, maybe even airplanes, maybe even charters. And of course, again, you have to throw resources at it. There's usually reports, there's follow-up, there's all kinds of activities. So this is the gap it creates. So really the role the service provider can play is to introduce automation. And that's one thing we're trying to do, and I'm sure some of my colleagues or counterparts in the room are doing this too. But we're using automated in-transit reports. We've got EDI connectivity to the customer. We've got a lot of digital shipping initiatives started where we're digitally sending the documents out. One thing we're using very heavy is origin inspection programs where we send reliable cargo manifests to our customers and they get pre-approved, and that's one way it speeds it up. But these are just ways you can work with both the customer and with the government programs to try to mitigate the impact of this. And I think the last one I was going to talk about here is the local supply sources. So I've got a metric here that says 55% of all of the material produced by either an OEM or a Tier 1 in Mexico has domestic content, and that number is going up. But when you're sourcing offshore, that means you have extended supply chains, and those supply chains are enabled by technology. And it's no secret that OEMs are starting to move their sequencing points away. You're starting to see longer and longer just-in-time lanes and sequencing lanes. Some customers are just-in-time, are doing sequencing in ocean containers. It's not happening a lot, but it is happening out there. So that's the challenge. The supply chain gap it creates, obviously transportation costs, but also you've got, I think these are more important. The further away you get from home, you have further exposure to things like weather and world events. Also, you fight the daily battle of communication issues, time zones, differing holidays, and things like that. For example, our corporate office, I think, is 7 hours away from Mexico. So we have to, really juggle if we want to have conference calls and things like that. So what role can a service provider play? Again, we can't bridge the gap by petitioning the government to have more programs or things like that. So we can introduce technology and people to try to minimize the impact that long-range supply chains have on our customers. I mean, the first and obvious way is we put control towers up. We have them at origin and destination, so we get close to where the customer is. We get in close proximity. The real thing, though, that'll impact this is really you just need to have greater linkage with the customer and the supplier on your technology, linkage into the MRP and linkage into the ordering system. And this could incorporate digital technology that envisions the whole supply chain from door to door. But the point is, the further up you get in the customer's ordering process, and the further you are into that technology, the more visibility you have, and the more you can mitigate the impact of having an extended supply chain. I mean, there's nothing worse than you see it for the first time when you open up the container at the port. So that's really just a quick walk in the time we had to just tell you some of the things we think we can impact. Just a quick summary, though. In case you're wondering who I am, by the way, and why there's a guy from Detroit standing here talking about logistics infrastructure problems in Mexico. I mean, I've been coming down here for about 27 years now. I started with Ford as an OEM, and then I was with a director at a Tier 1. So now I'm here as a logistics service provider. So I've come down here and I've lived some of these infrastructure challenges in a few different capacities. So I've felt the pain a few different ways. But I think more importantly, the Mexico automotive industry holds a near and dear position with me. I mean, I had a profound experience when I first hired in with Ford. I was there about 2 or 3 years, and they sent me to Mexico to an electronics plant on a project, and I was blown away when I went in there. First of all, the plant was spotless. This is in the early 90s. Plant was spotless. I look around, there's lean methodology everywhere. There's marketplaces. There's plan for every part. There's delivery routes. There's employee involvement teams. There's an employee involvement leader leading a team on a failure mode analysis discussion. And I have to tell you, this is stuff that in Detroit, we were just talking about starting. And Mexico had been doing it for 8 to 10 years at that point. So, when I got back there and we tried to do this stuff, I'd hear, it can't be done, we can't do this. And I'd tell them, get on a plane and go to Mexico and see it happening, because it's happening down there. So I think the U.S. auto industry was pretty slow to change, but they got it. They picked it up. But I think a lot of this drive that was started here in Mexico, specifically on creativity and lean technology, I know impacted me in my career, but I also seriously think it helped the U.S. auto industry realize they had to change or die, and they did change. So things are better. But back to this. These are good problems to have, so I don't want you to think I'm sitting up here, talking about complaints. I mean, I was in Detroit in 2009 when everything melted down up there, and I'm telling you, I wouldn't want to be standing here talking about what happened then. I'd much rather be talking about how logistics infrastructure challenges are created by growth. So embrace this. I mean, these are good things to have. The next thing is, I just want to reemphasize that the current efforts and investments that are taking place, the data shows they're working. I mean, it's getting better. I mean, any of you travel to Brazil, I mean, would you rather trade your situation for theirs? No way. So it's definitely improving. And just the final point is to say again, the value we bring is to understand these constraints, these issues. We understand how they impact the supply chain, and then we can bring a talented group of individuals to bear the task to help mitigate and minimize those issues. So thanks for listening. I guess those are the prepared comments. I'll take any questions if you have them. I know some of the other service providers are out here too, so if they've addressed some of these things in some other ways, I'd be interested to hear them.
Hi, David.
Yeah? Yeah, you're standing right in the light, so I can't see you.
Hi, David. I was wondering what would be the best way to improve customs operation, for example, in free trade zones to make importing processes much more efficient?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one, right? So when you get into that, I mean, you have to understand what your position is. It's a little bit like the root cause analysis I talked about. You have to understand what your issues are and what's holding you up there. And then once you do that, you have to put your actions in place to address those.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how?
I don't know. I got the Hellmann team back here that lives this. I don't know if you have anything you want to add there. They're right behind you. Go ahead, Honorio.
Okay, just to complement the answer, I think to make the process more smoothly and more efficient, definitely the connectivity, the IT solutions would help.
Right.
We're one step now ahead with the BUSEM, and as long as we continue as a country on that path, and also reducing the documents that we need from those statistics that David just showed, Mexico still requires in an average 11 documents to do an import, while other countries just need 2 documents. So hopefully we're getting closer from 11 to 2 documents pretty soon.
Thanks, Honorio. I wanted to turn that one over to my subject matter expert there.
Is there any other questions from public? Okay, well then, David, thanks a lot. Jeroen will take over there. He will be handing you a book. Please also stand in the middle for a nice picture.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
we can almost start the cocktail then.
Thanks, everybody.